Okay, in this video I'm going to review the brain and some of the important pathways in which sensory information gets to the brain, and also at the end one somatic motor pathway where information is coming down from the brain. Table 14.8 is good to review because it shows all of the different lobes of the cerebral cortex, the frontal lobe, some of the special features of the frontal lobe. The one I wanted you to know was the primary motor cortex, and that's true for all the other lobes. Knowing these special areas, these special functions within each lobe are good to know. What's not shown on this table that's associated with the cortex was the area called the insula. I mention that because all the gustation sensation, all the taste sensation information goes to the insula. And this just shows anatomically what I was talking about. I don't remember if I pointed this out in class. The insula is this area of internal cortex that's sitting not visible on the surface, but here you showed showing pulling away the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, and you can see some of that gustatory cortex hidden inside there. Next we're going to look at the spinothalamic pathway. This is the pathway that takes sensory information up to the primary sensory cortex of the brain. So the bottom part of the diagram that has the spinal cord in it, that really doesn't show you much new in terms of the sensory neuron bringing information in. Here you see the synapse at the posterior gray horn. And then from the posterior gray horn, we have a decussation. We have a crossing from one side to the other. Then this information is going to ascend through the anterior spinothalamic tract. It's going to go up to this area, which is the thalamus, where there's another synapse. And then we're going to use a third neuron to take that message up to the primary sensory cortex. Notice that this anterior spinothalamic tract carries messages from specific types of stimuli. Here at the bottom of the diagram, it indicates crude touch and pressure. Very poorly localized crude touch would be involved in this pathway. Then in the next pathway, this is still spinothalamic. It's still taking message from the spinal cord to the brain, but we're using different types of sensations. Pain, which would come from nociceptors, or temperature sensations that come from thermoreceptors, follow a very similar pathway. We've still got a decussation in the spinal cord, but now this axon from that second neuron is going to ascend through this lateral spinothalamic tract. Before we had the anterior spinothalamic tract being used. That's the only difference from this figure and the last figure. As the information moves up to the brain, we still have the thalamus being involved, and we still have that primary sensory cortex. Lastly, in the posterior column pathway, this is the last pathway that is ascending, meaning going up to the brain. These sensations coming from fine touch, from fine pressure and vibration, these are going to, instead of having a synapse in the gray matter, the sensory neurons take information through these posterior columns, and this goes all the way up into the medulla before there's a synapse. And then in the medulla there's a decussation, so we have our crossing. And then the second neuron goes up to the thalamus, and then the message continues up to the primary sensory cortex. You'll notice in the diagram before, around the brain, you had the body parts scattered out, which is related to the sensory homunculus. And here you see a man with very disproportionate parts. For example, the hands are very large. This is because there's a very high concentration of sensory receptors in those areas. So this image of a man is adjusted for the number of sensory receptors in the surface of each body area. And lastly, we'll look at the corticospinal pathway. And this is different because this is a descending pathway. The messages are going to start up here in the primary motor cortex, and they're going to descend through the brainstem and the spinal cord, and at the point of the medulla oblongata there's a crossing over, so you see that decussation, and most of the neurons that come down from the brain are going to follow this lateral corticospinal tract. So generally when you talk about motor information coming down from the brain, this is a corticospinal pathway. Then from that particular tract, you see synapses down here with motor neurons, and then the information goes out to those voluntary skeletal muscles.